So I'm going to talk about something that we call in higher education the diversity rationale, and this is the idea, and it's related to affirmative action. So this idea that we defend affirmative action by saying that it creates a diverse learning environment, and that is something that everybody benefits from. Now, this is a justification that, at least until now, the U.S. Supreme Court has accepted in multiple cases. Of course, there's a case right now in the U.S. Supreme Court questioning that, and I was actually cautiously optimistic about that case until the news from this week. And so I want to recognize that even the diversity rationale is under fire right now, and we don't know how much longer the court will accept it. But I'm going to actually critique the diversity rationale, and I'm going to draw from some of the research from my book, The Diversity Bargain. So the book is about how undergraduates at elite universities make sense of race and meritocracy. And I argue in the book that the way that we teach students to think about race and meritocracy does damage to reduce efforts to reduce inequality and to promote interracial dialogue. And so what I really care about is how do we talk about these things in ways that are more productive and much more cognizant of the racial realities of our society. And that's ultimately what I care about. So again, on the one hand, we have this rationale that I'm critiquing. On the other hand, that rationale, I don't know how much longer that will even cut the mustard in court. We'll see. Okay, so I started with this question: how do elites make sense of their accomplishments in a highly unequal society? So I think most of the people in this room probably know that we have growing inequality in the United States. We are more unequal than most other kind of similarly well-off countries, OECD countries, and we believe in meritocracy even more than other countries. Americans are much more likely to agree that people should be rewarded according to what they have achieved. And so you put these two things together, and we have this sort of very unequal kind of reward system. We start at different points, and so we have different access to that reward system. And then we have this inequality that gets produced and reproduced over generations. So we also have less intergenerational mobility than again, most other wealthy countries that are similar in those ways to the United States. So I was curious about how do elites make sense of their accomplishments given the kind of well-known inequality in our society, and particularly about racial inequality. And so, I thought it would help us understand how do we have these policies that continue to exacerbate inequality. And I cared about racial inequality in particular. So I decided to look on college campuses. I study education and educational inequality, and I thought, well, let's start with where elites often are starting, which is on elite college campuses, much like the one we're on today. So just a little backdrop, we know that there are unequal outcomes of the admissions process. These statistics obviously vary from year to year, but Black and Latinx students underrepresented on the Harvard and Brown campuses. These are the two US campuses that I studied. And I compared American students to British students, but I won't talk about the British students today, just in the interest of time. First generation students are underrepresented, so I feel in the last, say, decade or so, colleges have started to advertise, we have 15% first-generation students, but when you consider the fact that 2/3 of Americans don't have a bachelor's degree, to say that 85% of our students have a parent with a bachelor's degree is kind of extraordinary. So we know that the outcomes of admissions are we're not bringing in a cross-section of 18-year-olds to these selective colleges. So my research team and I interviewed undergraduates on these campuses. I'm going to focus today on our interviews with white students, being the sort of group with the most privilege. I think part of this was about thinking about, when we think about race, we often think about racial minorities, but we also have to talk about whiteness and how whites kind of imagine race as well. So I'm going to focus on white students. So we asked a bunch of questions related to college admissions. One of the questions was related to affirmative action. We said, really simply, should your college consider race or ethnicity in admissions? And, most students express support, strong support and pretty consistent support for affirmative action. And if you support affirmative action like I do, that's the good news. Ordinary American adults are much more divided in terms of, and tend to shift their view depending on how the question is asked. But I saw pretty uniform support. And they said things like, these are all pseudonyms, the student I call Elliot. We asked, should your college consider race or ethnicity in admissions? And Elliot said, I didn't think so before I got here. And I think so now because different groups of people I had a better experience because they provided me with insight that I otherwise wouldn't have. So you can hear that diversity rationale here, right? He recognizes, he comes to campus, he encounters students who weren't represented in his high school. That's in part because of residential segregation in the United States. And this was true for a lot of white students. And he recognizes that that was a benefit to his education. And there's a lot of research to back this up. So after the first court case affirming the diversity rationale in the late 1970s, social scientists kind of went to work to look at, well, what is the impact of diversity on the educational experience? And there's a whole host of positive outcomes in terms of racial attitudes, even cognitive capacity, future civic participation, plenty of positive outcomes. And so his intuition is, empirically has been shown. And again, so that's sort of the good news. Let me just read you this other quote. Ethnic diversity adds as much to the class as someone who's a world-class piano player. It's just a different sort of diversity to add. So you can see the kind of commodification of racial identities in this quote in particular. The problem with this kind of universal rationale was that there was very little recognition, particularly among white students, of racial inequality. And racial inequality didn't really come up when we asked questions about affirmative action. And many students had a hard time making sense of racial inequality. And so, on the one hand, we might think, well, maybe that doesn't matter. At least they're supporting affirmative action, but I argue in this book that this justification, absent an understanding of racial inequality, has some troubling consequences. And the consequences are part of what I call a diversity bargain. So I'm going to tell you about the diversity bargain. So the diversity bargain is this, that white students support affirmative action in as much as it benefits themselves. And there are certain expectations that they have given that rationale. And it leads to three consequences in terms of their expectations, particularly of their peers of color, that are troubling. So I'm going to start with the integration imperative. And so if you think about if affirmative action is a policy that is supposed to benefit their educational experience, students of color are expected to integrate at all times, right? So, all the Black, Latinx, and Native American students are almost uniformly assumed to have benefited from affirmative action, right? And we know that this is not true, right? And so, but because there's this assumption and there is this diversity rationale, students said things like, a student I call Anna. So Anna said, I think Harvard is a pretty diverse place, but I think that diversity ends up being a lot of different groups that sort of self-select and associate within their particular culture. I don't know that there's much interaction between the different groups. And she went on, and we said, well, what do you make of this? And she said, it really bothers me because it makes it really difficult to get to know people, because I'm not in any of those. Like, I'm not going to join the Black Students Association, and most of the groups that I'm in are not, and here she means race-defined. Because if they had a White Students Association, they'd probably get in a lot of trouble. And she said, I think it's just sort of sad because the interaction I've had with people of different backgrounds has been so great for me, and especially coming from a school where there wasn't a lot of that. She means a high school here. Again, residential segregation leading to these very segregated school experiences. So a few things to notice here about Anna. First, she sees the benefits of integration, just like the other students I read earlier. But the other thing that to note is that she kind of equates a Black Students Association with a White Students Association, right? It shows a kind of little understanding of why we might have a Black Students Association on a predominantly white campus and why that might be an important space in a way that a White Students Association on a predominantly white campus doesn't really make much sense. And the third thing to notice here is that she talks about she's not going to join the Black Students Association, right? She's not going to enter Black-dominated spaces. But again, she's expecting those Black students to always be in the predominantly white, the kind of white-dominated spaces of her campus at all times, right? And so, so there's this sort of, and I think that lack of understanding of inequality and that sort of diversity rationale leads her to this kind of problematic perspective. And the second piece of this diversity bargain is what I call a reverse discrimination script. And that is a script to make sense of any kind of failure or any kind of thing where a student doesn't get what they want, right? And so we asked all students of color and white students, have there ever been instances in which you felt you experienced racial discrimination? And so here's a student, Serena, and she said, if I hadn't gotten into Harvard, I would have felt that I'd been discriminated against. If someone else that I knew who was equally qualified and who was a minority, if they had gotten in over me. Now, remember, Serena got into Harvard, right? Arguably the hardest, or one of the hardest colleges to get into, right? But that script remains in her back pocket, right? She says, if that happened, then I would have. Now, imagine her going on to apply to graduate school, to apply for a job or internship. She doesn't get it. Affirmative action is an easy kind of thing to blame for why she doesn't win a meritocratic process, right? And so there's a sort of assumption that she will, right? And so even though she has been successful, that script is in her, and that's why I call it a script. It's already there, even if she hasn't experienced any setback, which, I think everybody experiences those setbacks in their lives, and she probably will at some point. Okay, so that's the reverse discrimination script. And again, I think this is part of a lack of understanding of racial inequality in particular. And the third piece of this is that some students had a kind of essentialized understanding of race and ethnicity. And so again, if Black and Latinx and Native American students were assumed to have benefited from affirmative action, they were expected to have a particular kind of racialized experience, often associated with urban poverty, in order to be seen as legitimately on campus. Here's a student, and she said, her pseudonym in the book is Karen, but that was before Karen meant something different, and I feel really bad about that. I actually feel really, so I always get stuck when I have to say her pseudonym. And she said, I don't think that because someone checked out the black box or like the Latino box, that should be what helps get them in. Maybe in their interview, you find that since they're Latino, they've done all these things that make them add something different to the cultural fabric of Harvard. I know people who are like a quarter Mexican who got the Latino Scholars Award, and their entire experience has been a white experience. And so rather than expand her understanding of what it means to be Latino in the United States, she sort of says, she rejects that student's lived experience and that student's identity and says that, no, that's whiteness, right? And that you shouldn't qualify. And so again, this student contravenes, so in this case it's an award, but it's the same idea where it contravenes this diversity bargain because the student is not, in her estimate, contributing to her kind of college experience, the cultural fabric of her campus. That's the kind of third piece here. And so I argue that this diversity bargain is really embedded in that diversity rationale and students' definitions of race and of merit. And I think that, we can see why these are problematic. These expectations of students of color and the beliefs about a supposed reverse discrimination can be harmful to students of color and to race relations on campus. And then, when we think about these students going on into being leaders in society, going on to making hiring decisions, working in the media, being policymakers, they're going to take those understandings of race and lack of understanding of racial inequality into that work that they do. And I think that that's, it's hard for them to make sense of racial violence, of the rise of white supremacy, when they don't see how racial inequality is embedded in the very nature of our society, including in college admissions. So I sometimes worry about this concept of diversity can sometimes do more harm than good, and because it makes diversity palatable to whites, but at significant costs. And these are students who, for the most part, are identifying as liberal, see themselves as liberal, and care about racial inequality, but don't have easy ways of making sense of it, I think in part because we haven't taught them. So the implications, I'm going to keep this short. First, I think in higher education, we just use much more language around equity and justice, and not just diversity. I think diversity doesn't go nearly far enough. While I also recognize that even diversity seems to be under attack, not just in higher education, but in K-12 education, any mentions of race seem to get the right increasingly worked up. And the diversity rationale, I see this diversity rationale as kind of the master's tools. It makes affirmative action palatable whites and I think also to Asian Americans, but via a kind of diversity bargain. And I just want to say a little bit, I had to say something about my new book that's coming out this month. When Robin invited me to this panel, this was before this book was done, and now here we are. But I think that there are some implications as we look to these young people going on to becoming adults and raising children. As these students grow up holding this diversity rationale, they may turn into kind of suburban liberals, many of whom have enacted policies to exclude and stigmatize people of color, especially those who are economically disadvantaged in the past and in the present, right? So this book is about the growth of Asian Americans in a suburban community, well-off community. And in the past, the whole project of suburbanization, suburbs are incredibly diverse in the United States right now and increasingly diverse, but this project of suburbanization in the 1950s and 1960s was in part white flight from these integrated schools, right? It was a way of kind of keeping schools segregated. They enacted single-family home laws in these places so that people could not afford to live there, minimum housing lot sizes, all of these ways to sort of create bastions of kind of economic exclusion and racial exclusion. And in the present, and so I think Asian Americans are an interesting case here because on the one hand, are benefiting from kind of proximity to whiteness in some ways, being able to access these kinds of communities because of selective migration. And on the other, there is what I found was a real stigmatization of Asian Americans in a suburban community who don't adhere to the kind of cultural norms. And there's sort of policies to maintain whiteness, white families leaving the public system, to send their children to private school, all these ways to sort of maintain status as there's a kind of race at the top. And, all kinds of kind of tensions related to status and privilege. And so I think that, we can see this sort of that incarnation of this diversity rationale in these suburban communities as well. So, and I think, Asian Americans are, as with the growth of Asian Americans, I think these questions of the master's tools and how do we make sense of that is increasingly important. Okay, so let me stop here, and I'm really looking forward to, this conference has been really generative, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.